She didn't cry out. She didn't beg for help. She simply collapsed right there on the wooden bench by the station platform, too bruised to stand, too tired to keep pretending she wasn't broken. People turned their eyes, pretended not to see, but one man did, a quiet cowboy with dust on his boots and grief in his eyes. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what had happened. He just picked her up, wrapped her in his coat, and took her home. Not to save her, not to fix her, just to let her rest. But what neither of them knew was that this act, small, wordless and kind, would unravel a story neither had told in years. A story of hurt buried too deep for language. A story of a woman who had been given away like a burden, and a man who had once buried a wife and never said goodbye. They didn't fall in love, not at first. But something gentler happened. She began to sit by his window. He brewed her tea without asking. And when her past came knocking with a letter, a name, and the ghost of a man who once called her worthless, she didn't hide. She stayed, because for the first time in a long time, someone had made space for her silence. She arrived with nothing left, not even her name, but someone gave her a place to sit and stayed. What did the letter say? Why did he never ask her to leave? And what finally made her say her name out loud? Again, stay with us to hear what happened next. Because not all rescues look like rescues. Sometimes they look like a cup of coffee and a chair pulled out beside the fire. She collapsed right as the train pulled away. Folks waiting at the depot only saw her from behind, an older woman with a sagging coat, boots splitting at the soles, and one hand trembling against the bench rail before her legs gave out. No cry, no call for help. She simply folded forward like someone who'd run out of places to stand. The station agent didn't move. A child pointed, but his mother tugged his sleeve. Most just looked away the way people do when something's too human and too hard to bear. That's when he stepped forward. A tall man with silver at his temples and dust on his coat hem. He didn't rush, didn't ask questions. He just walked up, crouched beside her, and laid his hand gently on her shoulder. She didn't flinch, though she didn't look up either. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think it's time we get you out of the wind." She said nothing. He removed his coat, wrapped it around her back, then lifted her as if she were made of paper and ash. Her cheek rested against his shoulder. A bit of blood had dried in the corner of her mouth. He didn't wipe it off, just held her steady. No one at the depot tried to stop him. No one offered to help either. He carried her to a wagon that stood under a bare-limbed cottonwood tree. It had one old mule and a few sacks of grain in the back. He set her in gently, like someone placing something precious into the only safe place left. The woman did not ask where they were going. The man did not say. His name was Marshall Dake, though she wouldn't learn that for days. He was a quiet man who spoke mostly with his hands sanding fence rails, leading colts, stirring stew in silence. A widower of 13 years, he'd lived alone on a patch of land 3 miles from town where the road bent toward the mesa. His house was small with a low porch, 2 rocking chairs, and a pine door that always stuck in summer. He hadn't meant to go to the station that day. Said later it was the wind that told him to ride in. That and a dull ache in his shoulder he got when weather turned or something was about to shift. He didn't think of it as saving her, just carrying someone who couldn't stand. She came to some time during the ride, lifted her head a little, then laid it back down without a word. Her eyes were swollen at the edges, one side of her face mottled with yellowing bruises. Her hands were calloused, but her fingernails were clean. Her body trembled now and then, like someone shaking off cold from far deeper than her skin. At the house, he built the fire high, boiled water, brought down a blanket from the cedar trunk. She sat on the edge of the bed and didn't look around. When he set a cup of broth in her hands, she took it, drank slowly, then gave it back. He didn't ask what had happened. She didn't offer. The kettle hissed. He sat across the room with his hat in his lap, elbows on knees, not staring, just being there. Later that night, she got up to use the chamber pot and nearly fell again. He was there in seconds, steadying her without a word. She muttered sorry, barely above a whisper. Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't spoken aloud in weeks. He didn't answer, just eased her back onto the bed, tucked the blanket under her feet, and stepped back. She fell asleep before she saw him pull the chair into the hallway and sit there till dawn. In the morning, she didn't remember his name. He hadn't told her yet anyway. But she noticed how the room smelled of wood smoke and soap. Someone had placed her bag, a sagging, buckled thing, near the bed. It hadn't been opened. Nothing touched. On the windowsill sat a chipped enamel cup with a few wildflowers inside yarrow rabbit brush and one stalk of prairie aster. She stared at them for a long time. The next day he brought her tea and set it near the fire. He nodded toward the front porch if she wanted fresh air. She didn't move. But when he stepped out to check on the horses, she walked slowly to the window and stood there watching him. He moved like someone used to working alone, efficient, deliberate, unbothered by silence. He didn't look toward the house once, but somehow she didn't feel forgotten. When he came back in, she was sitting again by the hearth. "I can help cook," she said, voice steadier now. "If you've got anything left in the pantry." He nodded once. "Plenty." That evening, they shared a meal of potatoes, beans, and a slice of cornmeal bread he claimed to have made good enough not to kill a man. She smiled a little at that. He noticed but didn't say so. They didn't talk much. Just passed the salt. She ate slowly, chewing as if remembering how. Afterward, he handed her a folded shirt, soft, clean, too large, and motioned to the washroom. She paused in the doorway, looked over her shoulder. "You're kind," she said. Marshall turned back to the stove, just doing what I'd hoped someone might have done for Ellen. That was the first time she heard the name. She nodded, then disappeared into the back room. That night she dreamed of the train again, the platform, the wind, the sound of the wheels pulling away. But this time someone caught her before she fell. She woke before dawn. The chair outside her door was empty now, but the fire had been tended. And on the windowsill sat a second flower, fresh cut. She had expected to collapse and be left behind. She did not expect a man to wait beside her fire through the night. The next morning, Ione stood in the doorway of the kitchen, unsure if she was meant to stay. The smell of coffee met her first strong black left warming on the stove. A tin mug sat beside a plate with half a biscuit and a knife that had been wiped clean. Everything in the house had that look, used but cared for. Nothing wasted, nothing perfect either. Marshall was outside already in the corral. She watched him through the window. He moved slow but sure, tossing hay with a rhythm that suggested 1,000 mornings just like this one. A tall, sorrel mare pressed its head into his shoulder. He didn't flinch. She poured herself coffee, took a bite of the biscuit, then sat. No one had asked her to. There was a quiet order to Marshall's house. The towels were folded the same way, all of them, the chairs pushed in, boots lined neatly by the door. Yet nothing about it felt strict or cold. Just steady. That afternoon, he returned with a basket of eggs and didn't say much beyond afternoon. She said thank you anyway, though she wasn't sure what for. For the food, the fire, the silence, or for not asking anything at all. She stayed in the spare room, a modest space with a patchwork quilt and a window that faced east. Each morning, light filtered through the curtains in thin threads. She would sit there listening to the house breathe, the tick of the clock, the creak of boards when Marshall passed by, the whistle of the wind at the eaves. On the fourth evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, Ione was sweeping the front porch when she found the picture. It was on the far shelf near the door frame, turned backward, as if someone hadn't wanted to see it, but hadn't had the heart to throw it away. She picked it up gently. A woman's soft-faced eyes bright. A little girl sat in her lap, mouth open, mid-laugh. Both wore white blouses and prairie skirts, a bit old-fashioned, even for the time the photo was likely taken. The girl had freckles. The woman's hand rested over the child's heart. Ione put the frame back where it had been, still backward. She didn't ask. Later that night, Marshall sat in the kitchen after supper, plucking soft notes from an old banjo. The sound was quiet, almost apologetic. It drifted into the hallway to the edge of Ione's door. She sat on the bed, not asleep. Didn't move, didn't breathe too loud, just listened. When the strings fell silent, she heard his chair scrape back across the floor. Heard him rinse the cup she'd left. Heard his boots cross toward the front room. It had been years since anyone played music near her. Longer still, since it hadn't meant something was about to end. The next day, they worked in the garden together. Not side by side, she weeded by the fence. He repaired a water trough closer to the barn, but within sight. At noon, they ate bread and beans under the cottonwood tree. Neither of them filled the air with talk, but it didn't feel like loneliness anymore. Just two people keeping each other company without needing to explain how. That night, thunder came. Ione stood in the hall with a lamp in her hand. She didn't like storms, never had. They reminded her of things breaking, doors slamming, shouting from behind walls. But this storm stayed outside. The windows shook once or twice, but the house didn't. Marshall walked past her with an extra quilt, held it out. She took it without a word. Their fingers touched briefly. Both of them looked away. On the sixth morning, she found a note on the table scrawled in clean block letters. Gone to town. Back before supper. M. He didn't write Marshall. She folded the note into her pocket. It felt strange being the one left behind, but not in a bad way. She cleaned. She made stew. She dusted the mantel and didn't touch the picture. When he returned, she was humming just faintly as she stirred the pot. He stood in the doorway watching her, boots damp hat in hand. Smells good, he said. She looked over her shoulder and nodded. Hope it tastes better than my cornbread, he added. That earned him a real smile. Not a big one, but real. After dinner, they sat on the porch. A quiet dusk, crickets murmuring in the brush. The stars not quite out yet. She sipped tea. He chewed on a sliver of wood he'd been whittling. Finally, she spoke. My name's Ione, she said. He nodded. I know. She hadn't meant to stay. He hadn't meant to ask. But still, they were both there watching the same sky. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was something smaller, quieter. The kind of feeling that moved beneath the surface like roots pressing through soil. Ione didn't name it and Marshall wouldn't have tried. But it was there. You could tell in the way they passed each other the sugar tin, or how their steps slowly fell into a matching pace when they walked the path to the barn. Some days they barely spoke, but the house didn't feel empty anymore. One morning, Marshall brought in a box from the shed, set it by the hearth. A banjo case sat atop it, and below were books, yellowed seed catalogs, and a half-stitched quilt that hadn't been touched in years. Ione sat on the floor and opened the lid. The scent of cedar and old wool rose up sharp and clean. She pulled the quilt into her lap and traced a line of blue thread with her finger. She started it the spring before the fever, Marshall said quietly. Ione nodded. Your wife. He didn't flinch at the word. Ellen, he said. She waited. She liked to finish things. Couldn't bear something left half done. Ione folded the quilt back into the box. I understand that. The next day she began sewing. Not to replace what was lost, just to keep her hands busy. She used the squares Ellen had cut, added some new ones from an old skirt she no longer wore. The result wasn't perfect. The colors didn't always match, but it held warmth, and the pieces held. That night, Marshall glanced over from his chair by the fire. She'd have liked that, he said. Ione looked at the quilt in her lap, then at him. Would she have liked me? He didn't answer right away. I think, he said slowly, she'd have seen you were tired, and made tea. That night, the air turned colder. A blue wind came down from the mountains and the windows creaked with it. Ione had trouble sleeping. She got up, lit the small lamp, and sat at the kitchen table in her shawl. The flame trembled in the glass. She took out a piece of paper, started to write a letter she didn't plan to send. I don't know where you are now, or if you'd recognize me. I am not the woman you hit. I am not the girl who stayed. I am someone else now, and I don't owe you my silence anymore. She folded the paper, then tore it in half. By midweek, things had settled into a rhythm. Breakfast was always at 7. Marshall fixed the coffee. Ione made the eggs. She insisted on sweeping the porch even when her ankle ached. He repaired the chicken coop, sharpened her sewing scissors without being asked. It was a life made up of small kindnesses. Little gifts passed back and forth without ribbon or mention. One day, Marshall went into town and brought back a small parcel wrapped in butcher paper. She opened it to find a bundle of dried herbs, yarrow chamomile, and horehound. For your tea, he said, looking anywhere but at her face. She pressed the bundle to her chest. Didn't say a word. But the peace didn't last. Peace never does not when something deep inside hasn't settled. It started when Marshall found her standing in the yard just after dusk, her shoulders stiff, eyes locked on something far away. Trouble, he asked. She didn't turn. I heard the train whistle today. He waited. I wondered if someone might be looking for me. Are they? She didn't answer. Just walked past him into the house. That night over stew, Ione spoke with her hands in her lap. There was a man, she said. He wasn't mine to begin with. But someone gave me to him like I was livestock. I stayed because I didn't know how not to. Marshall didn't interrupt. He said I was too old to leave, too tired to fight back. He liked to remind me how little I had left to bargain with. She looked up finally. I still have bruises where his words landed. Marshall nodded. You don't owe him your story, he said. But I'll sit here and listen, if that helps carry it. She didn't cry, but she breathed deeper after that, as if her lungs had just remembered how to stretch. The next morning, he found her mending the back of his shirt without being asked. She'd stitched it with thread the same color as the fabric. You wouldn't notice unless you knew where to look. He didn't comment on it. But that evening, he set an extra slice of pie on her plate. She looked at him amused. Trying to fatten me up, are you? He smiled barely, but it was real. No, he said. Just figured you've gone hungry long enough. Later that night, she opened the door to her room and stepped into the hallway. Found him standing there, holding the kettle. Tea, he asked. She nodded, and they sat at the table, the silence between them no longer heavy, but warm. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something that could be stitched together from the soft pieces still left. It was early April when Ione asked if she might walk beyond the corral fence. She said it like someone testing the world again, unsure if it would still bite. Her voice soft, almost unsure, one hand lightly on the doorframe. Marshall didn't ask why, just looked up from oiling his saddle and nodded. Follow the path past the cottonwoods. There's a clearing beyond the pines. I go there when I need to breathe. She gave a small nod, wrapped her shawl tighter, and stepped outside. The wind caught the hem of her skirt and lifted it just enough to show the purpled scar still healing along her shin. The trail was uneven but gentle. Wildflowers had begun blooming where snowmelt had seeped into the soil, tiny splashes of yellow and violet pushing up through dry grass. It took her longer than it would have taken someone younger, stronger, but she didn't rush. She paused often, hand on a trunk breath, drawn deep, and looked out toward the ridgeline, as if to remind herself, you are not where you were. At the clearing, she stopped. It was just as Marshall had said, a soft patch of earth ringed by tall pines. No sound but the breeze, the high cry of a hawk, and the faint rustle of deer moving through brush. She sat on a fallen log and let herself feel the stillness. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. It felt earned. She didn't tell Marshall what the clearing meant to her, but he noticed she went there often, every few days sometimes, with a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, sometimes just to sit. She always came back with pine needles in her hem and a faraway look that softened her face. She had begun humming again, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes while hanging wash on the line. Little tunes with no name, fragments of melodies from some old life before it cracked apart. One evening after supper, Marshall brought out a worn tin box. He set it on the table between them and opened the lid. Inside were small folded papers, a button carved from antler, 2 rusted keys, and a locket with a woman's face behind glass. She gave me this, he said, touching the locket with a finger. Day she told me she was carrying our daughter. Ione waited. She didn't make it. Neither of them. Silence wrapped around them like a wool coat. I buried them up behind the pines, he added. That's why I go there. She reached over and laid her hand gently atop his. Didn't say a word, but she didn't pull away either. The next morning, Ione baked 2 loaves of bread. One for the house, one to take to the clearing. She packed it in a basket with a jar of preserves and a small knife. At the last minute, she tucked a square of the unfinished quilt over it all. She didn't ask if she could go with him. She just met Marshall by the porch when he came out with 2 mugs of coffee. He saw the basket, then saw her expression, and nodded. The walk-up was slow. The pines were taller than she remembered, and their shadows stretched long across the trail. They didn't speak much. When they reached the clearing, Marshall knelt beside a simple wooden marker. No name, no dates, just a single smooth stone placed in front of it. Ione set the basket down nearby. For a while they sat in silence. Birds trilled. Wind passed through the trees like an old hymn. After a long time, she asked May. He looked over, said nothing, just nodded. Ione pulled the quilt from the basket and laid it carefully over the grave. Not as a cover, but as an offering. I never got to bury my son, she said quietly. There was no grave, no name, just silence. She brushed her fingers along the edge of the fabric. I guess I just wanted someone to have something soft. Marshall didn't speak, but he reached for her hand and held it there, calloused palm over hers. That evening back at the house, he sat at the table long after she'd gone to bed. The tea kettle had gone cold. The fire had burned low, but he stayed there, fingers touching the rim of her empty cup. When he finally rose, he placed a second cup beside hers, already ready for morning. Then he turned toward the hallway and paused at her door. He didn't knock, just stood a while, head bowed, then walked away. The next day, she found a new chair on the porch. It matched the one Marshall always used, plain, sturdy, sanded smooth. When she looked at him with a raised eyebrow, he only said, "Felt odd sitting out there alone." She sat in it that evening, and the one after that, and most nights after. There are places pain won't follow if you let someone walk the path beside you. The weather turned. Spring softened into early summer, and the wind no longer howled down from the hills. It hummed gentle and warm through the cottonwoods. The horses swished their tails slower in the paddock. The sky stayed light long after supper. Ione had learned the rhythm of the ranch now. She knew which plank in the porch creaked beneath her heel, which hen laid twice a day, and when the bread needed turning in the wood stove just by the smell. She folded laundry in the same square corner of the table, always humming that same tune, and Marshall never asked what it was. He only paused sometimes when she did, as if he missed the quiet music once it stopped. Some days she caught herself thinking, this isn't mine, not the house, not the safety, not the way his eyes softened when she poured his coffee, or how he let her sit in silence without trying to fix the silence. It felt like a borrowed peace, and peace she'd learned could be taken back just like anything else. One morning a letter arrived. Marshall brought it from town, handed it to her at the table, and watched her face change. She didn't open it. She just stared at the handwriting. Small, precise, like someone who wanted to control everything, even how they hurt you. From him, he asked quietly. She nodded. She didn't cry. She just placed the letter on the windowsill unopened. Let the morning sun rest on it like a weight. Days passed. She didn't speak of it, but something shifted. She stirred the soup slower, forgot to refill the sugar tin, spent longer in the clearing beneath the pines, her hands clenched in her skirt, like she was bracing against something only she could see. Marshall noticed, of course. He didn't press. He just left an extra mug of tea by her door each night. Some mornings she drank it, some she didn't. It was 3 days later when she stepped into the barn, hands clenched. He was brushing down the mare, quiet as always. I need to say my name, she said. He looked at her, waited. Not the one he called me, not the one I used just to stay hidden. She stepped closer, her voice shaking only slightly. My name is Ione Callahan, and I used to be afraid of hearing it out loud. Marshall set the brush down gently. Well, he said, I'm glad to know it. That night she opened the letter. He didn't ask what it said, but when he passed her in the hall an hour later, her hands were stained with ash. She had burned it behind the house. The next morning she took out the unfinished quilt again. She added a new square stitched from the corner of her old traveling coat, the one she'd worn when she arrived at the station, bruised and silent. She added a small tag beneath it. Just her initials, I see. She folded the quilt and placed it on the end of her bed. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun fell behind the low ridge. I was married once, Ione said suddenly. Before him, a long time ago. His name was Caleb. He died young. Marshall didn't turn to look at her. He was the only man who ever said my name like it meant something. She paused. Until you. The next morning, Marshall packed 2 sandwiches and a flask of coffee. He didn't ask, just nodded toward the wagon. She climbed in. They rode in silence through the flats and along the stream bed, passing cottonwoods just beginning to bud. The air smelled of wet dust and new green. When they stopped beneath the big rock outcropping, he handed her a sandwich. She ate it slowly, legs dangling off the side of the wagon, staring out at the plain. Do you ever think it's too late, she asked. For what? For starting again. Marshall took a sip from the flask. Thought a moment. I think sometimes the trail don't go where you thought it would, but that don't mean it's not worth following. She nodded, folded her hands. Would you mind, she said, if I stayed longer? He didn't answer right away. But he reached over, took her hand, and laced his fingers through hers. Was hoping you would, he said. That night she didn't close the door to her room. She left it slightly ajar, the way one might leave a porch light on, not calling anyone in, but saying, it's safe if you want to come close. She no longer whispered her name like a secret. She said it out loud, and someone stayed. It was the smell of smoke that woke Ione. Not the kind from the stove or the evening fire. This smoke was sharper, wild, unsettled. It came in through the open window in her room just before dawn. She slipped from bed and stepped onto the porch barefoot, clutching her shawl to her chest. Out over the ridge, a thin line of black rose into the morning sky. Marshall was already saddled and halfway to the gate. "Back acres," he said shortly. Old pine went dry. Lightning must have found it. "I'm coming." He shook his head. "Not safe. I'm not staying behind again." The wind had picked up by the time they reached the edge of the pasture. The fire hadn't spread far yet, but the grass was dry and the old pines, brittle from years of wind, crackled as embers touched them. Marshall moved with quiet urgency. He soaked burlap sacks, dug quick fire lines with the back edge of a shovel. Ani hauled water from the stream slower than him, but steady. Her arms trembled, but she didn't stop. When the flames reached the fallen fence line, she stood between it and the clearing. He shouted to her, "Get back," but she didn't move. Instead, she swung the wet sack with both hands, striking the sparks before they could take the dry brush. She wasn't fighting the fire. She was guarding the place where the quilt lay, where someone else had been laid to rest. It took hours, and when it was done, they sat in the blackened dirt clothes, soaked hands blistered. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Marshall said, "You didn't have to." "I did," she replied. "Some things deserve protecting." He looked at her, then not just seeing her but knowing her, and nodded. In the days that followed, they rebuilt the fence together. The burned wood was hauled off, replaced with smoother rails from the shed. They worked without complaint, without hurry. One afternoon, while she passed him a hammer, Marshall paused. "You should know," he said, "some folks in town are asking about you." She kept her gaze steady. "Let them," she said. The next week, a stranger rode up the road. Clean coat, hat too new, boots polished. He didn't get down from his horse. "I'm looking for a woman who goes by Callahan," he called. Marshall stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands. "Don't know anyone by that name here." The man squinted. "You sure word as she came in off the train stayed with someone out this way." Ione watched from the window. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide. When the man didn't get an answer, he clicked his reins and rode on. Marshall didn't look back until the dust had settled. When he came in, she was still by the window. "I didn't run," she said. "No," he answered. "You didn't." That evening, he took her hand again. But this time, he didn't let go. They sat by the fire that night, not saying much, just listening to the crickets, the creak of the rocking chair, the long breath of the house settling in. Finally, Marshall said, "You're not borrowed peace." She looked over. "You're part of this place. Same as the land. Same as me." Ione didn't speak. She just leaned her head against his shoulder. And for the first time in years, the weight she carried wasn't only hers. The past didn't disappear, but it no longer decided where her story ended. By the time autumn came, the land had grown quiet again. The hills softened to gold. The wildflowers gave way to dry seed and rustling grass. Even the wind seemed to move slower, like it didn't want to startle the peace that had finally settled across the ranch. Ione sat by the window most mornings now, a basket of mending in her lap, a cup of coffee cooling nearby. From that small wooden chair, she could see the cottonwoods sway the barn roof just past the hill and the corral where the horses shifted their weight in the sun. Every so often, she'd glance toward the road, but not in fear. She didn't wait for anyone anymore. Marshall had built her a proper shelf in the kitchen, said it was for her herbs and dried apples, but really it was because he liked how she touched each jar before opening it, as if saying thank you to the thing inside. She'd planted root vegetables before the frost, lined the pantry with preserves and cornmeal, restitched every curtain in the house with her initials tucked into the hem. One morning she found a second coffee cup warming on the stove beside hers. It had her initials on the bottom, burned gently into the clay. They didn't talk much about the past. It wasn't necessary. But sometimes in the long hush of evening, Marshall would say things like, "You sure quieted the house down," or "Funny the porch don't creak so much since you've been sweeping it." And she'd smile, not in flattery, not even in thanks, just recognition. One night the wind picked up hard, cold, sharp, the first frost of the year. Marshall went to check the barn. She followed, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. They stood together under the rafters, watching the horses stir their breath, white in the dark. "I used to be afraid of nights like this," Ione said, "when I didn't know where I'd sleep, or if I was even allowed to. Marshall didn't speak. He just took off his coat and put it over her shoulders, same as that first day. She closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, but because it finally felt safe to rest. The next morning, she found him in the garden, staring at the frost-kissed leaves. "We'll lose the last of the squash," he muttered. "We have enough," she said gently. He looked over. "We?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "We?" That Sunday, they rode to town together. Folks looked. A few whispered. She didn't look away. She walked beside him, head held level, her hand looped into the crook of his arm. They stopped at the general store, and he introduced her. "This here's Miss Ione Callahan. She'll be keeping the books and scaring off the mice." She laughed, and the shopkeeper, an old woman with sunspots on her hands, smiled and said, "'Bout time that house had someone in it again." Back at the ranch, the quilt was finally done. Ione laid it out on the bed one afternoon, smoothing each square with care. The patterns didn't match. The stitches weren't perfect, but it held warmth, and her hands had been in every inch of it. Marshall stepped into the room, looked at the spread, and nodded once. "That looks like something that knows what it is," he said. She smiled. "So do I." That night, they sat by the fire as they always did. No big declarations. No promises carved into stone. Just 2 cups on the table, 2 chairs side by side, and a silence that no longer needed filling. Outside, the wind moved across the field. Not cold, not sharp, just a quiet breath through the tall grass, whispering of things left behind and things still to come. Ione watched the flame flicker in the hearth, then looked at Marshall, already dozing with a book slipping from his hand. She stood, draped the quilt over his shoulders, and sat back down, by the window, where she belonged. She came with nothing left, not even a name spoken in her own voice. But she stayed because someone gave her a place to sit, a cup to drink from, and a silence that felt like home. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes in quiet moments. A chair pulled out beside the fire, a name spoken gently, a silence shared with someone who doesn't need you to explain. Ione didn't set out looking for love. She wasn't rescued. She was received. And Marshall, a man whose heart had long gone quiet, didn't ask her to change. He simply made room. Maybe that's what we all need in the end. Not someone to fix us, but someone who says, "Stay as long as you like. You're safe here." If this story touched something tender in you, perhaps it's because you too know how it feels. To keep going, even when bruised. To find kindness late in life. To believe just maybe it's not too late to be known. We tell these stories because they matter. Because every person, no matter their past, deserves a place to sit by the window. If this story moved you, we invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, for more healing stories like this. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Do you want to see more stories of quiet redemption, of love that arrives softly but stays? Should we write what happens next in Ione and Marshall's journey? Your presence here matters. Thank you for sitting with us a while. The fire's still going. Stay as long as you need.